Yeah, I don't that's a really good question because I think because I so enjoyed my time there, I maybe have like rose-colored glasses. But, I I think I had a lot of students when I started teaching, both in the UK and the US, and they heard that I had done some work on the BAU, and they were just like, "Oh my god, that's my dream. How do I do that?" And I think especially because I taught clinical psychology and forensic psychology, and I taught a little bit of criminology, and especially my forensic psychology students, so many of them wanted to be profilers. And they just they really didn't understand, I think, the skills and what it takes to do that.
That's Paige Wilcoxson, a forensic psychologist. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Paige Wilcoxson is a forensic psychologist whose career spans the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, a postdoctoral fellowship in sexually violent predator evaluation, a decade teaching forensic psychology at universities in the United States and the United Kingdom, and direct work inside high and maximum security prisons. She's a true crime consultant, speaker, and media expert who appeared on NBC Universal's Unknown Serial Killers Series 2. She's the upcoming host of Consumed, Case Studies in Forensic Psychology, a podcast applying forensic psychology to true crime case analysis. Her areas of expertise include violence and sexual offending, serial homicide, case formulation, criminal responsibility, insanity, and risk assessment. Forensic psychology's roots trace back to the late 19th century experimental psychology, when a handful of researchers began asking whether psychological science could improve legal decision-making. The field did not begin inside the courts or the criminal justice system. It began in laboratories with early studies on memory and suggestibility. These studies created the first scientific challenge to the legal system's reliance on eyewitnesses. A 1908 book called On the Witness Stand argued that psychology should be used to evaluate testimony, detect deception, and assist courts. Just as there is today, there was early pushback on whether psychology's evidence was strong enough and did the entire discipline intrude on legal authority. These debates helped shape modern forensic psychology, and in many ways, they're still alive today. As the profession expanded throughout the 20th century and psychology overall matured, forensic psychology moved into clinical assessments of competence, insanity, and risk, investigative and behavioral factors, and legal issues such as jury research and memory science. Today, we're going to talk about Paige's interest that led to her career, her journey in the profession, and some of the insights that she can bring to understanding the criminal justice system and criminal behavior. Hey, Paige, thank you for coming on. I'm so excited to have you here. It's, first of all, forensic psychology is such a fascinating topic to me and so many other people. And I had the chance to listen to you, as you already know, on the consult. And I was just really so impressed by how well you articulated such complex topics. And I really was also moved by the care you had for people within the criminal justice system. So I'm excited that you were able to come on. I'm so glad we had the chance to meet in person in CrimeCon. And I'm excited about what you have coming up in the future.
Thank you so much, Jason. Yeah, I felt so fortunate to be on the console. I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge true crime podcast genre fan in general. So when Julia asked me to be a guest, I jumped at the opportunity. And I will say, and I mentioned this to you at CrimeCon, but you reached out to me after my first episode and you sent me a lovely email. And the consult was my first appearance on a podcast, and I was a little nervous about it. And it just was so encouraging and just motivating. And so I was very grateful for that. And it was just lovely to meet you at CrimeCon. And so I'm really happy that we could do this.
Yeah. And as I recall, I think I came up to you at CrimeCon, and tell me if I have this right. And I asked you whether I had told you you should start a podcast. And that shows
Yes,
you how bad my memory is. But one of the things in that note was you should really start a podcast.
it was. It was. And it's something I'd been thinking about and toying around with for a while. So to get that email was like, okay, all right, maybe I can do this.
Yeah. It's funny in life how sometimes the little things that you do, how many times in my head do I think something nice about someone and don't share it? And I've realized over time, go ahead and share it because you have no idea what's going on with someone. It might pick up their day. It might inspire them to do the thing that they want to do. So I'm glad it landed at the right time. It got there at the right time.
It did. And that is a lovely piece of advice that we should all follow more, I think.
Totally. Totally. So I wanted to go ahead and get started. And I know for a lot of people, we have sort of preconceptions about what forensic psychology and psychiatry are. Just to give you a piece of background so you know, when I was first working in clinical mental health, he was not officially my mentor, but a forensic psychiatrist. He was in clinical practice and he was a clinical researcher. And he worked part time in a clinical practice, but he became my buddy and we worked together with a lot of clients. So I got to learn a lot about what I think forensic psychology and forensic psychiatry are very
Mhm.
early in my career. But one of the things that I've noticed is that a lot of people, whether you're in psychology or not, don't understand a lot about it. So, that kind of brings me in my head back to just kind of wondering how you ended up getting in the field, what some of your early interests were, what sort of pulled you towards psychology, and then also doing work in the, forensic criminal justice, criminal behavior space.
Yeah. I honestly think it all goes back to true crime. So I feel it's almost like full circle now in my life. When I was probably a teenager, I started reading true crime. My dad had a home office and he had lots of bookcases and lots of Anne Rule books and Joe McGinnis. So I remember reading those. And I also remember around that time, there was, there was like a made for TV movie. I don't know if you ever saw it. It was about Diane Downs. And I think Farrah Fawcett played Diane Downs. And so I remember watching that and just being really, really interested in it. I've been a vegetarian since I was about 9 and just always very empathic. And it really almost like bothered me how people could do these things. Like I didn't understand it. And it was something that I wanted to understand better and that I just found really interesting.
Well, that's
Um,
kind of interesting that you remember the Diane Downs movie. I think it's called Small Sacrifices. That was
yes,
the Farrah
yes,
Fawcett one.
yeah,
Because it's a really interesting case because it was a woman, I think in Oregon, right, who murdered her daughter and
yes.
attempted to murder two
Believe
of
so.
her other kids.
Mhm.
And it's one of those things, we're used to crimes where let's say this big bad character does this bad thing to another person, but we're not really used to that idea, particularly when we're younger, about sort of like someone who's supposed to be a protector,
Yep.
a mom, doing harm to her children. So I could see how that would get the psychology wheels spinning, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I just couldn't really fathom it. And so that sort of, kicked off this journey to understand it better.
Yeah. And and the interesting thing about that one, it's repeated itself, that story of Diane Downs, Susan Smith,
Mhm.
um, in a different way, not exactly the same way, but Andrea Yates. And I kind of think
Yeah.
to myself, I was interested in true crime probably when I was young, but the first real case that made me pause and go, what in the world is going on here was actually Susan Smith. And I think
Yep.
that probably happened somewhere around the time I was going to college or I was in high school. Something was going on with it around that time. And I just remember like really having a hard time reconciling how a mother could do
Mhm.
something like that. And the easy answer sometimes is to say to yourself that this person is evil. But I'm sure your experience, similar to mine, working with people who have done very, very bad things, is that it's not that black and white. It would be nice if we could file it away that way.
Yeah, and I think our brains like to categorize. I mean, and so we like to, good person, bad person, but when I worked with offenders and evaluated them and just being in maximum security environments, I would look around and I would think, there probably isn't one person here who was fortunate enough to have the childhood and the life I had. Um, Most of them
Mm,
had, childhood trauma or head trauma or issues with substance use or, all of the above. And so it's this, just interplay of all of these factors, plus the contextual factors of what's going on at the time, the stressors in their life at the time that can lead to this. But it is really, really complex and it is, almost like a puzzle to figure out.
yeah, yeah. And it's always, I mean, I've always found one of the hard things who we become and what our behavior is a combination of so many different things. Our early childhood experiences obviously have a big impact on shaping our motivations and our personality. Our personality and our motivations drive a lot of our behavior. And then in later life, you can have, experiences have less of an impact, but if you have a traumatic one,
Mm.
it can be a big one. But it is a complex and complicated puzzle. And I'll never forget a law enforcement officer telling me when I was asking him, well, what do you think make people do bad things? And he gave me an example of a case that he was looking into. And as he was working the case and working the case, then he was sort of putting together the biography of his suspect. He realized the guy's life was a lot like his and
Yeah.
trying to figure out, because he had grown up in a tough environment, et cetera, trying to figure out what caused him to go left and what caused this guy to go right was very difficult. And he sort of felt like it's a coin flip. And
Yeah.
um, that, and really made him think that some of the suspects that he worked with and dealt with were more like him than he realized. And he actually thinks that made him better at his job.
Yeah, I absolutely think just having that understanding and that empathy, yeah, would make him better at the job. And I think it's critical as a psychologist. I think it's critical for anyone who's involved with the criminal justice system, just not to just try to categorize people um, as good or evil, or just try to reduce what they're doing to just that offending behavior, because there's so much more that goes into it.
Yeah. And so was it psychology first that you started exploring just generally and then focus on forensic, or was your original focus forensic?
So originally, I wanted to be an attorney. I actually wanted to be an animal rights and environmental attorney. And so my undergrad was in philosophy and literature, which is like very different. But I went to school in Scotland. I went to St. Andrews, and they did not have a pre law program. So I studied philosophy and literature. Um, and when I finished my degree, I really wanted to stay in Scotland. I loved it. And I couldn't get a visa to stay. So I ended up moving to Portland, Oregon, which is where my sister was in college at Reed University. And so I landed there and I didn't know what I was going to do. I wanted to go to law school, but I thought I probably needed like a year off just to, just return to the US, get acclimated, figure things out a little bit. And I ended up working at a residential treatment center with kids who were labeled severely emotionally disturbed. So these were kids who could basically were just too unsafe to live in their home environment or foster care or even a group home. So it was a secure setting for kids, 6 to, maybe 15, 16.
My mother's, she was a teacher and administrator, and her early career was spent in Maryland being a principal and assistant principal of a school like that. So I grew up with the
Yeah,
stories. Yeah.
it's really interesting work. And I liked it a lot more than I thought I would. And so at that point, I kind of changed what I wanted to do. And I went back to school and I went to Northwestern and I got my master's in counseling psychology. And it was very psychodynamic, very focused on children and families. And I went back to that same organization and was a therapist. And I think it was just really tough for me. Um, just working with the kids and yeah, I mean, most of them had been through trauma and, working also with their families of origin or foster families. And it was just not my
And in
thing.
child therapy, part of the job really is you're a therapist for the caregivers as much as you are for the children. And if you can't make progress there, I think one of the hard things is sometimes you can feel responsible.
Yeah.
And, I don't think it's necessarily fair, but I know that a lot of child psychologists really struggle with that weight.
Yeah, it was very challenging. And then sometimes you'd have a child who was doing very, very well in a structured environment, and you would be working with the families or foster families trying to get them back home. But if the family, for whatever reason, isn't able to sort of maintain the boundaries and what was put in place, then often the child doesn't succeed back in the home environment and comes back. And, seeing that was also very, very difficult. Um, so I reassessed and I decided I would probably be better suited to doing evaluations and teaching. And so that's when I went back and did my doctorate at Pacific University, which is outside of Portland. And that's when I really decided to focus in forensic work.
It's really interesting because I think about just listening to what you were saying, animal rights, law, and psychology, and I was asking myself, what's the thread between all these things? And curious what you think, but the first thing that came to mind for me is that all three of those things, animal rights, law, and psychology, sort of concern themselves with how humans sort of perceive, value, and regulate the suffering, particularly child psychology, of beings that can't advocate for themselves. Like they really connect to a
Mhm.
different part of the same puzzle.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've often wondered the same thing, and I don't know if I've come to a conclusion about that, but I definitely think it has to do with this sort of just this strong sense of empathy I have, be it towards animals or children or victims, and just I think that is the thread. Um, and then it's just always been very important to me to do something I feel is, I mean, I don't know, this is going to sound a little cheesy, but for the greater good. Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to work in an office and just work for some corporation somewhere. I want to do something that I find meaningful. And
Yeah.
all of these things I kind of find meaningful and
And
worthwhile.
motivated by
Yeah.
sort of helping and being of service. Because I think one of the sort of like fundamental deep questions for me, which I sort of hear in what you're saying, is like, I have always been curious about why societies protect like some vulnerable beings, fail to protect others, and the moral and legal frameworks around that. Because law itself is meant to create this like fair and just and
Yeah.
balanced system. But the humanity that exists underneath and beyond this. And it's funny you listed all those people. I remember for me, the first time I ever worked with somebody who I knew was a sex offender, or actually, it's not even that he was a sex offender, but he was a pedophile who claimed he didn't act for it. One of act on it. One of the most difficult things for me in that situation was the amount of empathy and sympathy that I grew to have for him.
Hmm.
And I think there is something to be said for being able to see anyone for their humanity,
Yeah.
whatever it might be. And I think there need to be people who can see. It doesn't mean that we're Pollyanna, right? It doesn't mean that we think all things are gonna turn out for the good, but I think there need to be people who are trying to be of service to every other person.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't know how you could be, a therapist or any sort of treatment provider working with, people who have offended, um, and not have empathy because you're just not going to be able to do your job. Um, I feel like you need that empathy to be able to engage in treatment, and that doesn't mean excusing or um, sort of, you know, like whitewashing what they've done. It's more about really trying to understand it to help them, change their behavior and not reoffend. But if you don't understand it and you can't have that empathy for it, then I don't think you're going to be very successful as a treatment provider.
Yeah. And I remember early on I had told myself I'm never going to work with sex offenders, that it would be too triggering for me. But I actually found, and I didn't do a ton of work because I was just doing adjunctive work with other treatment providers, but I found it very rewarding in the sense that, one, helping them with their healing, but also it's on the we're on the front end of a curve, even if they've offended. We're
Mhm.
trying to reduce the likelihood.
Right.
And, I've talked to some advocates in the space who have said, like, we don't spend enough time thinking about how we can help people not offend. We spend a lot of
Mhm.
time on focusing on how victims can keep themselves safe. And there's merit to that. And we should be doing that. But why are we attacking the other side of the problem? And I think that your profession does attack the other
Yeah.
side of the problem.
Yeah, I will say treatment with offenders was not my favorite, and it can be incredibly frustrating sometimes. I'm sure in your own experience that you can't change anyone. They have to want to change. And
Sadly,
yeah,
sadly.
and sometimes they're not ready to do that.
Right.
And so sometimes treatment can be frustrating. And so I prefer evaluation. And I think evaluation just emotionally is also easier because in treatment you're sitting with someone for weeks or months or even years, whereas doing an evaluation you're with someone for a few hours. Um, but I think people who do the treatment are just should just be applauded, and like they are doing such important work, and I agree it's not recognized as much and it's not talked about enough.
Mm. Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting too about evaluation that I think is really valuable to the process of, let's say, clinical treatment, not necessarily evaluation for court, is that you guys bring the same skills, the same psychological skills to bear in evaluation, but you're able to do something that most clinical practitioners can't do when they're sitting in the room doing long-term therapy with somebody. So you can give the recommendations, right? Like
Mhm.
everybody else has to sort of like wait for the client to get there. But you guys can actually give the recommendations, which you feel, I imagine there's a sense of feeling like you're doing something there, that you're able to
There
have an impact.
there is, I will say for me, it did depend on the setting I was working in. Um, I did some training in a maximum security prison. So I was at Oregon State Penitentiary doing evaluations on offenders there. And, my goal basically was to do a clinical evaluation with treatment recommendations. So, what can we do within the confines of the prison to help this person function better? And it got to be extremely frustrating because the resources people have access to in a prison and what you could theoretically
Mm,
do was so limited. I remember saying to my supervisor, like, what recommendations can I write realistically? They're not going to get in-depth psychotherapy. There may be a cognitive behavioral group they can attend, but like they're not. It was just so limited that I did find it pretty frustrating.
yeah, which is kind of oddly backwards because you're in an environment where you're going to have a lot more broken people, but a lot
Yeah,
less resources. I could see how that would be
yeah,
frustrating. One of the things I'm wondering about, I know on your academic journey, you eventually had the opportunity to, was it intern at the FBI's behavioral
yeah,
analysis unit?
yeah. I was an intern.
Tell me about that and how that happened. I had never, I didn't even know they had people who were interning there.
Yeah, I don't even know how I found it. But like a lot of people, I was obviously, just amazed or really interested in the idea of profiling. I remember seeing Silence of the Lambs and thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is so amazing." So I think I must have just stumbled upon it through that. And yeah, they have an honors internship, and I don't know if it's still like this, but at the time there was one at the behavioral science unit, which is like the BAU. Like the BAU was used to be called the BSU, but when I was there, the BSU was more of like the research teaching section. And then
Hmm.
they had one at the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, which is where VICAP and the behavioral analysis or profiling units are. So that's where Julia and everyone on the consult was. So I had applied to do the one at NCAVC, and I knew my chances were slim to none, but I just thought I'll apply. And amazingly, I got it. And you have to go through everything to get your top secret security clearance. So they do a background check. You have to take a polygraph. And I thought it was just really cool because the year I was there, it was all females.
Oh,
There were
neat.
5 or 6 of us,
Oh, that's
and
cool.
yeah, I just thought that was super cool. And then when I was there, I had just started. I think I had just done my dissertation proposal, and my dissertation was threat assessment of the anti-abortion shooters. I don't know if you remember,
Oh,
like
so
in the late
yeah.
'90s, there was
Yeah,
this.
where we had a spat
Yeah.
of people coming
Mm-hmm.
in, whether it was, I think, at clinics,
Yep.
at doctors' houses. You
Yeah.
also had Eric Rudolph at
Yep.
the Olympic bombings, who, the one that Richard Jewell got blamed for. You just
Yeah.
had a wave. He also did, I think, a bomb in Birmingham during that time. It was just an enormous
Yeah.
cluster of like violent attacks on abortion providers.
Yeah. So I think sort of like being a feminist and being interested in threat assessment and violence, this is kind of the topic I landed on. And so I had asked the FBI if I could collect some of my data there, because I knew they would have more than I could find elsewhere. And
Oh, neat.
I was able to do that, which was amazing. And yeah, I absolutely loved my experience there. It was, I mean, fun sounds odd to say, but it it was just fascinating.
Hmm.
Getting up every day uh, and just being able to go to the unit, sit in on profiling sessions. I was also able to take classes at the FBI Academy in Quantico, which was really, really interesting. And I wanted to stay. I was like, when I graduate, can I get a job here? Can I stay? And,
They're like,
and
I
they
got
were,
bad news for you. You got to
I
become an
know.
FBI agent first.
Exactly. And I was like, "Oh, maybe not." Yeah, just being an agent, like, wasn't I knew
Do
it
some
wasn't my
white collar
thing.
crime for a
Yeah, like,
decade.
Julia, yeah. I'm like, and then even then, it's like you might not get back there. Like, the
Oh,
chances of being
yeah.
able to get back there are so slim. I was just like, "Yeah, maybe not."
Well, you know the story Julia tells about how she went to this event where somebody from the FBI was there, and I think it may have been John Douglas or it was somebody who was like, if you are planning on joining the FBI to join the BAU, don't even do it because it's impossible.
Yeah, yeah, basically. And so I was like, "Okay, maybe not." And so that ended my time there. But yeah, it was fascinating. I
What
really,
did you
really
get to work on while you were there? You mentioned you got to sit in the profiling
Mhm.
sessions, classes. You got to work a little bit on research for your dissertation.
Yeah, I also worked on the serial homicide research project. So that was a big chunk of what I did. So, at that time, they, I think, really were moving into wanting to be more data driven. So, obviously Douglas sort of started it all with doing these interviews of serial homicide offenders, and so you obviously can learn a lot from the interview, especially if you can gauge whether people are being truthful or not. But I think they did learn a lot from the interviews, and so then they were looking at, well, what sort of like quantitative data and baseline data can we collect on the actual behaviors that are going on within the offense. So I did a lot of the data collection on that project.
Yeah, and it's one of the interesting evolutions of the BAU or BSU before that, when it was originally founded as a behavioral science unit, a lot of what they were doing was based on sort of qualitative interviews and
Yeah,
anecdotal information, and they were making really great connections. And I always think it's kind of funny to me that as they changed their name to analysis, behavioral analysis unit, which is more accurate description of what they
mhm.
do, they've actually become more scientific
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
in what they do.
yeah. They
Um,
they have, which I think is a really good thing. And yeah, I mean, it was looking and just coding of what happened at the crime scene and what happened to the different victims and what did the offender do, really to get that sort of baseline data, which has now evolved as they've continued to do research. And then obviously there's, you know, kind of corresponding to that is there's a bunch of academic research that also goes on, which I think is really, really valuable and important in trying to understand sort of the phenomena and what's going on.
yeah, and I think maybe people may not understand how important collecting that baseline data is because really criminal profiling is probabilistic.
Yeah.
So you're really just sort of picking probability, but you have to have some core data to to identify that probability.
Yeah, like I actually I had never read it and I just read Mindhunter. Um, and I was just like, how did he even
That's
do
John
this?
Douglas's
John
book.
Douglas's, yeah,
Yeah.
his first book on just like the beginning of profiling and what he was doing and how he kind of developed this methodology. And I'm still like, well, like how did he know that when there was no baseline data? Like I just, and obviously he had a ton of experience in looking at crime scenes, but still like it
And probably
just
the gift of intuition. I
definitely.
think John Douglas had the gift or
Yeah,
has the gift of intuition.
absolutely. I mean, I just could not do that. That's just not, I just don't have that skill. Uh, like he does. And yeah, but it still amazes me because, in my mind, you really need that sort of baseline data to know, what hypotheses to make.
Yeah, and from your perspective, are there sort of misconceptions about that space of BAU or criminal profiling that a lot of us have that that aren't like the reality or are like the reality?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I don't. That's a really good question because I think because I so enjoyed my time there, I maybe have like rose-colored glasses. But you know, I I think I had a lot of students when I started teaching, both in the UK and the US, and they heard that I had done some work on the BAU, and they were just like, "Oh my God, that's my dream. How do I do that?" And I think especially because I taught clinical psychology and forensic psychology, and I taught a little bit of criminology, and especially my forensic psychology students, so many of them wanted to be profilers. And they just they really didn't understand, I think, the skills and what it takes to do that because I'm not a profiler. I worked on that unit and I attended some trainings, but if you asked me to profile a case, like I could give you a guess based on some research, but I don't have any experience going to a crime scene and doing that crime scene analysis. And I think a lot of people, especially people who maybe want to be profilers or who are interested in forensic psychology, think that that's what it is when it is some of that, but a lot of it is really based on investigative experience and experience analyzing crime scenes, which is why when I've been on the consult, I think I think our skill sets complement each other, but I do not have the skill set they have in
Right. And nor do
investigation.
they have the skill set that you have. Because I think that's actually a misconception. Because, like you said, there are criminal justice students and then also psychology students who would love to be profilers. But I think there's some people who believe that almost everybody at the BAU has like a deep background in psychology. They might take some psychology courses. There might be a psychologist who ends up in the unit. But I mean, they have executives, they have people who have been toxicologists, they have people who have been street cops. It really takes a combination of a lot of different things for the unit to be effective and some common skills. So, I could see how a forensic psychologist could become a profiler, but not every profiler has to be.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And they'll usually bring in forensic psychologists when they really want depth. That's my understanding.
Yeah, when I was there, there was one psychologist on the unit who was not an agent, and she largely did research. I don't think she took part in the profiling sessions, but I could be wrong. But yeah, I know in speaking with Julia, they would often bring in psychologists, which I think is good. I think you need sort of all of these people with all different types of expertise because most of the cases that they're working on are really difficult cases.
Yeah. And so what happened after once you walked out of the BAU, you went and finished your research and
Yeah,
then
I finished my doctorate and then I decided to do a postdoc. And I'm trying to remember what it even was. I think it was like in behavioral justice policy or something. But essentially, it was mostly in evaluating people who had been committed as sexually violent predators. Um, so, for people who don't know, I think there's 18 or 19 states that have SVP laws, and I did my postdoc at University of Washington, so I was in Washington State. But it's basically after you serve your sentence in prison, you can be what's called civilly committed. And so you have another trial, and it's not a criminal trial, it's a civil trial. And they basically determine whether you are more likely than not, which is like just above 50%, have a chance of reoffending. So if you are found to be more likely than not to commit a future act of sexual violence, then you can be civilly committed um, for an indefinite period of time, which is
mm,
usually until your risk level drops. Um, so I was doing those evaluations and it was out on McNeil Island. And so I would have to take the Department of Corrections ferry from Steilacoom, which is on the mainland in Washington, and I would take the DOC ferry out to this island. And the only thing on the island is a prison, which I think is now shut, and the Special Commitment Center, which is where all the SVPs were. So It
So
was a
it's literally like a sex offender island.
yes.
Like,
Yeah.
wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, because no one wants to have the facility near them.
Mm.
Um, and so as far as I understand, I could be wrong, but my understanding was this was the only place they could figure out where to put it in Washington. Um,
Not
and
in
so
my backyard.
right,
Makes
not in my
total
backyard.
sense.
It's on an island. And in California, it's in Coalinga, which is like in the middle of the desert. So typically these places are kind of in the middle of nowhere because no one wants to be near them. But yeah, so I spent a year doing those evaluations and I really learned a lot about risk assessment, who's actually violent, who's actually at risk for reoffending. And then I took, all sorts of different forensic seminars as well, which was really interesting. Um, and then after that, I moved to the UK and got a senior lectureship and started teaching.
What took you to the UK?
I wanted to go back because I was ejected from Scotland without a visa. And then I finally had the skill set. And so I applied to a bunch of different sort of lectureships. And I was fortunate enough to get one at Nottingham Trent University, which was
Oh,
great.
neat.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
neat.
loved it.
And so when you were there, you were working as a lecturer, you
hmm
were
Yeah, I was a
doing,
senior lecturer in forensic psychology. And then I also did a little bit of criminology.
okay.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I had for you was, I think about people who do forensic psychology, and I almost think, you know, there are multiple sort of subdisciplines under it, but I think in general, forensic psychologists tend to need to be able to communicate, which makes sense. They need to have cultural competence, analytical skills, good critical thinking. But the one thing that I think forensic psychologists probably, well, you also brought up empathy. So I
Yeah.
think that also fits for anyone in a psychological field because you have to be able to understand other people's perspectives. But I think resilience yourself, and you kind of alluded to this when we were talking about working with children.
Yeah.
But I think like resilience is one of those shadow key competencies to any work that goes deep into understanding other people or any work that involves helping too.
Yeah.
Um, Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I think it is really important. Although I think you can have a great deal of resilience and still suffer from burnout. And so I think it's always important to sort of like monitor yourself and be aware of that. But yeah, whether you're doing therapy, and I think as I mentioned, I found therapy to be more challenging for me, just emotionally and yeah, just sort of engaging was more difficult. But even doing the evaluations, you often are hearing things that are very, very difficult. Whether it's actually what happened during the offense, or it could be about the offender's childhood and trauma they have. And so you do have to sit with it. And I think you do need to take care of yourself. And, like any helping profession, just monitor your own, I think, emotional state and mental state and take breaks if you can when you need to. But I think a really difficult part of it is that is not always inherent in the environment you may work in. Um,
Yes.
you
Not
know,
necessarily built into the walls.
yeah, and it's really really hard. I mean, I remember, after my postdoc, I kind of made a decision not to be working in secure settings anymore because, the actual work is emotionally difficult. But for me, going into those secure settings was actually quite difficult. I found them to be very oppressive, just
Yep.
yeah, and it's not just being there with people have committed violence, but it's also like the sounds of the cells clanging, the
Oh,
the
yeah.
smells,
Yeah.
the lack of daylight, and
It's
I
not
just
all
made this.
roses and
Yeah,
sunshine.
I made a decision for, like, my own self-care that working in those maximum security or high secure places was just not what I wanted to be doing. Um,
It's interesting. I was thinking about what you said about resilience at the beginning of this. And I think you kind of illustrate it in what you're describing. Because I think that what resilience is, it's not about not taking a hit, because we all take hits. It's about being able to bounce back.
mhm.
And some of us bounce back in 20 seconds from something. Sometimes it takes us years to bounce back from it. But the key to bouncing back, I really think, is like learning lessons as you go through it, learning a little bit about yourself and what's right for you and what, like all these things that you were talking about finding the right environment, finding the right space.
Yeah.
It's the bouncing back that represents resilience, not so much I don't take a hit. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I think you are absolutely right. I really like that.
yeah,
And
because
I
I
think
think,
that yeah.
oh, sorry.
No, and I think that comes with insight, just
Oh,
being
yeah, it
able to bounce
takes
back. Yeah,
time.
yeah.
Yeah, it takes time because I think sometimes, when we go into certain fields, and I think this can be true about law enforcement, it can be true about psychology and a bunch of others, there is this perception that in order to be resilient, you have to be tough. And because
Mhm.
you're tough, you can't have empathy. And I think in reality, like it's not about having tough armor. It's about knowing how to grow from the hit. And so it really doesn't, like, you could have tough armor or not tough armor, but are you growing from the hit? Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. I remember one time, um, I'm not gonna say where, but I was with a friend who was also a forensic psychologist, and we were going to visit well, we were gonna visit this prison, and I wasn't actually gonna go in because I was pregnant at the time, and she wanted to go see this prison, and I was like, "Okay," and so I introduced her to a professor I knew who had access, and so she was gonna take her around the prison, and I was gonna wait outside, and, someone said to me, you know, I worked as a prison psychologist throughout my pregnancy, and I was there right up until I gave birth. And why didn't you go in? And all of these things almost berating me. And it
Hmm.
really felt like, you know, part of me thought, well, maybe I should have been tougher and maybe I just should have gone in and it's not really a big deal. But then I did have some insight into the situation and I knew I would have felt anxious and uncomfortable. And it wasn't so much that I was worried about being attacked or assaulted. It was more like I knew like pregnant people get stared at everywhere. Right.
Hmm.
I remember going into elevators and people asking if they can like touch my stomach and just being like,
Hmm.
why would I let you do that? I don't know you. But I can only imagine being really pregnant in a prison, the amount of just attention and stares I would get. And I was like, I don't want to subject myself to that. And that's okay. And I was really, pretty angry and frustrated about this other clinician, saying that to me and kind of judging me for
And
the
it's
fact that
like,
I didn't want to go into the prison. Yeah.
oh, I think there's a beauty to listening to yourself. Something was telling you that this wasn't right for you and you were going to be more fulfilled and happy in that environment. I've always thought, so I'm a relatively low anxiety person myself. It takes a lot. But I've always been jealous of people who have anxiety because I say, you guys get the warning sign. I bang my head against the wall 14 times before I realize, maybe this isn't something I should do.
Yeah,
And I
it's
think,
hilarious.
well, it's the truth that I tell people because I do assessment in like leadership development settings and some of
Mhm.
its personality and some of its motivation. And I'll run into these people who, on the sort of you look at the big five.
Yeah.
Well, let's call it adjustment for the purpose of people understanding. They'll be very low in adjustment, and they'll feel really bad about it. And I'm like, I wish I was you.
Yeah.
I wish I could learn the lesson after touching the stove once.
I I really like that because I do tend to be a little bit more anxious and neurotic, so now I'm gonna try to reframe it as a superpower.
Absolutely, total. The other one I think that is also a superpower is regret. I think people really sort of underrate the beauty of being able to have anxiety and regret. And I almost look at it as like this bell curve, sort of like in economics, where you get the marginal return on investment. When you're thinking about your past mistakes and your regret, that's where you learn. That's where you
Yeah.
grow. I think the problem for people is they stay on the train past the top of the bell where it's starting to get
Yes, where
diminishing
it's not
returns.
useful.
Right? So it's really like you guys have the best of it. You just got to learn to get off the train.
Yeah, I like that so much. And that so corresponds with, like, a lot of the literature on, like, performance anxiety and stuff,
Yeah.
like, there's this sweet spot where it's good, but then if it's too much, it's like, "Oh gosh," like, no.
I can tell you from life experience on the other side of that thing, you guys are better off. I mean, there are
Okay,
upsides and downsides,
I'm gonna
but
think of it that way now.
right? You can at least flip it on the next person who comes up to you and tells you you should go into prison while you're pregnant.
I
That's
was like, "Are you serious?" I'm like, "Really? You're
right.
telling me this?"
Like, are you okay? Is there some projecting going on
Right. I'm
here?
like I'm like, "I'm totally cool with not going in right now."
That's so wild. I am, you know, one of the things that I find really interesting about forensic psychology in general, and I think a lot of psychological disciplines are like this, and I'm kind of fascinated by all sorts of things, but I think you guys, obviously, a big part of your space is psychology, but you're also operating in that space, like a lot of psychologists, where it intersects with sociology. Like, how does
Mhm.
someone's behavior affect the group? How does the group affect the person's behavior? But you're also bringing in things like criminal justice and criminology and law and medicine. And there's just sort of kind of like we were talking about the BAU people, but for a forensic psychologist, you need to know a lot about psychology. You need to know a lot about a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And that's whether you're doing something like dealing with offender behavior, or you're doing criminal profiling, or you're doing different kinds of assessments. I think at the end of the day, you guys have to know a lot about a lot of different things.
Yeah.
And there are also many things that you can do in forensic psychology. So I wanted to ask you just a little bit about what are the different paths people can take to get there, and what kinds of things can they do across the spectrum in that space?
Yeah, so yeah, I think it can be quite varied. Although I think most people who work in forensic psychology are probably going to end up either working in the correction system or a secure hospital. So I would always, I mean, warn is a little bit of a strong word, but I always make sure my students knew that most of the jobs are in these areas. So make sure you feel comfortable working in a more high secure setting. Um, and that's just the reality of it. Like those are stable jobs. They're good jobs. The pay is, okay, maybe not in relation to the huge student loans, but the the pay compared to a lot of
Not the
other
only field like
is
that.
good. Yeah, exactly. Like, um so just make sure you're comfortable with that. But you can go into private practice and do evaluations for the courts. You can teach like I did. Um, you can be a jury consultant. A lot of people think of the criminal side of it, but forensic psychology is also the civil side. So I know people who have gone more on the civil side to do like child custody evaluations, which
Hmm.
honestly I would not touch with a 10-foot pole. But there's also that sort of civil side of personal injury, personal distress, things like that. So
I
yeah,
know
it can
one
be quite varied.
forensic psychologist. I worked with a couple who did the child custody evaluations, and that, oh, trying to find truth in any of that is pretty wild. But I had one who worked for the United Methodist Church, forensic psychologist that I knew. And their job was all restorative justice. When there was conflict between people within the congregations where someone had done something wrong and they owned it, and it was all about that. And I was like, wow, what a cool way to
I think that would
use.
be really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
that
what a
would be
cool
really
way.
cool.
uh, Well, what are the parts of it for you that you find most rewarding?
I think, I mean, I no longer practice and I no longer teach, but I really, I really did like doing the evaluations. As I said, I didn't like being in the secure settings. I really love teaching. Teaching is just a huge passion of mine, which is kind of why I think I do like sort of going on podcasts and doing presentations because I do see it as sort of an extension of teaching. Um, and I do, I think I do like as a fan of true crime and the genre, it really is trying to get into someone's head and understand what's going on. I mean, I think it really does all go back to me as an adolescent, reading these books and watching these made for TV movies and trying to figure out this puzzle of what's going on. Um, and so I think that's always been the driving factor and why I've been interested in forensic psychology and true crime. And I think that is just like a big piece of me that has never gone away.
Yeah. And I think that there's something, I talk to people about this all the time, and they ask, because as I'm sure you've probably caught on, I'm not exactly a true crime podcast, but I have plenty of people from the space of crime on. And I read this piece recently where I was talking a little bit about this. But I think for me, part of the reason why I find myself gravitating back toward the criminal justice system and crime, it is the one space where suffering is so clear. But the thing about it is, we as humans all suffer. In true crime, that suffering is put on display. And one of the interesting things about it is I've noticed it's a space that unites people. And I mean, I don't mean we all agree politically, but we can all relate to what's
Mhm.
happening there. And we want to understand why and how that suffering happens and how we can make less of it happen. And I think that a piece of that, I think the psychology piece is getting underneath the skin of that, because I mean, there are probably two things about humans that are pretty common. One, we want to survive. Even in our worst moments, we're driven towards survival. And then the other thing that we all do is we suffer. And without suffering, I think it's hard to imagine a world where we would be as empathetic as we are. And so these things are very deeply human, right? Our safety, our shared suffering, and all of those other pieces of it. And so I like to sort of think to myself, there really aren't true crime stories, they're human stories.
Mm.
And these are human stories that anyone can relate to. I thought I would never relate to, like, I think of people like Dan Harrington and Jill Harrington, who lost their daughter, Morgan Dan Harrington, when she was a college student at Virginia Tech. She had gone off to UVA and she disappeared and was found murdered. But when I sit down and talk to them, and, Jill says something like, what do you do with ashes? And she was sitting there and thinking, what do you do with ashes? Well, if you have ashes and you have water, you can make clay and you can build something. That is something anyone can relate to because everybody's had that moment, if that makes sense.
That makes
And
total sense. I mean, I remember when I was new to therapy, I think I was working on my master's and I was at a clinical placement and I was working with this woman and she was a Black woman. She had severe depression. She was lower socioeconomic status, really struggling. She had just gotten discharged out of the hospital and I was seeing her in a partial hospitalization program. So she was sort of there most of the day getting treatment and then going home at night. And she looked at me and obviously I was a lot younger, I was white, I was privileged, and she said, "What can you tell me about my pain? Like what
mm,
like who, basically who are you to be treating me?" Which like fair question. And I was, on one hand, I was like, okay, she's got a really good point. Like, but on the other hand, I looked at her and I said, you know, you are the expert in your story, not me, but we have both felt pain and we both felt suffering in different ways. And if you will let me, I think I can try to understand your experience and help you because I've also shared those emotions. And maybe they're not exactly the same, but we both have had these emotions and I would like to try to help you through this. And I didn't know if it was exactly the right thing to say at the time. And I remember talking to my supervisor, but she stuck with me and we actually developed a really good working relationship and which was, I think, very, very rewarding for me because I did see her, improve. But I think sort of that is speaking to what you're saying is that we're all sort of,
It's universal.
humans that can understand, these feelings and the pain and the suffering and the fear. Um, yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's some truth to that. I remember one moment where it dawned on me. I I was at work one day and I was with a teenager and her world for her was falling apart. And I think in the moment she felt like everything was truly collapsing. And I remember watching her cry and she was just heaving in pain. And, I remember saying to myself in my head, like, I know she doesn't realize it's going to be okay. So I just need to be present with her. So then I go home and one of the kids can't find his toys. And he is crying and he's heaving and he looks like he is going to fall over. And I thought to myself, pain is pain.
Yeah.
There is not a hierarchy of pain because that little kid who feels like his world is going to end because he's having that toy, or that teenage girl who's falling apart, in that moment for them, they are feeling their deepest amount of pain. And Khalil Gibran said this like beautifully, the poet. He said, pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses our understanding. And all of us have those moments when we're in pain, where our shell and our understanding of the world has been broken. And even if what you went through is something that I could never go through or another fathom, I have been to that max spot where the shell's broken for me. And that's a place where we can all relate and love each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Very
So I think, long story short, I think you did give her the right answer.
yeah. I've often thought about that, but yeah. Yeah.
So as you're headed off into your new ventures, I know you did the consult, you've got something coming up with NBC. You mentioned potentially a podcast, which I'm still hoping for. Um, what is it that you're hoping for you and you mentioned teaching, and that got me. I'm just curious as we're wrapping up, what are you hoping for you on a personal level? What do you want to get? And I know you said earlier in the interview that you really enjoy that notion of helping people. What is your hope that you can sort of give back?
Yeah. I will say I've always been, so I think I started listening to true crime podcasts in like 2016. And I remember like True Crime Garage was one of the first podcasts I started listening to that I really liked. And I've really, really loved the genre since then. And, no longer practicing psychology and no longer teaching, I've missed it. Like I've missed interacting with people and talking about cases. Um, and so, I think it was probably about a year ago, I started thinking more seriously about maybe doing a podcast. And I wanted to do one in which I felt I had something to offer. Um, I didn't want it to be exploitative. But at the same time, like I really like podcasts that do focused on um, unsolved crimes because I think they have a lot to offer, and I think it's just great to get more attention on these.
Attention for this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's amazing, but in thinking about a podcast I wanted to do, I was like, that's not my area really. Like, I don't know what I would have to offer that because my expertise is more in the offender. And so I thought, how could I bring my expertise in a way that is going to offer something that's not just going to be like entertainment or salacious, but that's going to help people, understand um, both the offending behavior, but also the criminal justice system, the field of psychology, um, who really we should sort of fear and be wary of because it's usually not strangers. And so I landed on the idea of a podcast, which I'm planning on launching this fall, which is called Consumed Case Studies in Forensic Psychology. And my hope is that it's going to be sort of a cross between really storytelling about what happened during the commission of the crime, and then sort of a lecture I might give to my forensic psychology students and really
Oh, neat.
understanding, how you would go about evaluating an offender. What are the psycholegal questions? And then, like, what happens in the criminal justice system? So that's the goal. And yeah, the goal is to provide a greater understanding of all that. And personally, for me, like, I went to my first true crime sort of podcast festival almost a year ago. And I did a panel with Julia and with Charlie from Crime Lines. And I really felt like I had kind of found my people. Like, it was
Hmm.
just so lovely. I met so many victims advocates and podcasters and just people, you know, open to discussing cases and just interested in the same things I'm interested in. And they were so welcoming. And so that's been really, really great for me and sort of diving deeper, I guess, into true crime.
Neat. Neat. Well, I'm looking forward to it. And thanks for coming and talking to me. I really appreciate it. Please come back when you launch your podcast so we can talk a little bit more about your first few cases and
I would love
episodes, and
to.
that would be awesome. All
Yeah.
right.
Thank you so much for having me and just generally for your sort of encouragement and for sending that first email.
Yeah, well, it's not every day that you see somebody who you think is bright, interesting, empathetic, honest, and all those things. And those were the vibes that I was picking up and listening to you. So, I'm glad Julia was willing to pass on your email address and connect us.
Thanks, Julia.
You didn't make her sign an NDA, so
I'm not a fan of those, so.
right, me neither. All right. Well, you take care of yourself, Paige.
Yes, you too, Jason. Hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining Paige and us for this discussion. If you'd like to join us for more discussions and conversations with other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us at our Patreon at www.patreon.com/the Silver Linings Handbook. For those of you who are interested in true crime, we've got a great Substack called the True Crime Times that you can find on Substack. I also have a new Substack of my own called The Center Holds. Come and check that out too. It's really about how the center can hold in a really fragmented world. I'm excited about all of these different things that are going on. I'm excited to continue having these discussions with you all. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all in a few days.